as we lay perfectly still, watching the course of the gunboat by the flashes of her guns and by the rockets she was sending up to attract her consorts, we had the satisfaction of seeing her laboring furiously past us and firing wildly into black space. For my part, I was mightily proud of my first attempt and baptism of fire. Blockade running seemed the pleasantest and the most exhilarating of pastimes. Thomas Taylor, a blockade runner. Blockade running was a dangerous task, and it proved to be very important. Taking advantage of geographical features of the Cape Fear region and strategic ship design, blockade runners served as the lifeline of the Confederacy during the Civil War, breaking barriers established by the Union Navy. The Civil War broke out in 1861 after South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. The Union strategy of successfully destroying the Confederacy was the Anaconda Plan created by Winfield Scott. The Anaconda Plan was a plan to block off southern ports by the U.S. Navy to stop the supply of materials and to take control of the Mississippi River. If the flow of materials was mitigated in the Confederacy, it would be easier to defeat them. This also created isolation in the Confederate States since it was nearly impossible to trade normally. The most important ports on the Atlantic, such as Wilmington and Charleston, benefited the Confederacy the most. These areas were planned to be more heavily blockaded by the Union ships. Lincoln instituted the blockade on April 19, 1861, and established blockades over all southern ports. Within a week, the ships in the blockade started to prevent various ships from entering the ports. The Union blockade stretched 3,500 miles along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts and contained approximately 500 ships and utilized over 100,000 sailors. Even though the Union Navy's blockade managed to capture and destroy about 1,500 blockade runners, there were still thousands of blockade runners that managed to break barriers and push through them. Blockade runners usually operated privately and usually accessed the materials and weapons from English companies. The materials generally included guns, ammunition, dry goods, shoes, blankets, and drugs. The blockade runners would usually purchase the materials from a place like Bermuda or the Bahamas. One of the most important places to take those materials during the Civil War was Wilmington. Wilmington is located approximately 25 miles from the mouth of the Cape Fear River and was one of the most important ports along the Atlantic coast. Wilmington was especially important for blockade runners to travel to because the railroads connect directly to Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy. Close to the end of the Civil War, Wilmington was one of the only ports still controlled by the Confederates, since Charleston and New Orleans all fell by 1864. Blockade runners also had an 80% success rate when entering the Wilmington area, so it was considered one of the lifelines of the Confederacy. Blockade runners had to enter the Cape Fear River in order to reach Wilmington, and during the Civil War, there were two ways. The old inlet near Southport is the proper mouth of the Cape Fear River, and it is between Oak Island and Smith Island. The new inlet was the second way for the blockade runners to enter the Cape Fear River to get to Wilmington and was the most popular. The new inlet was a waterway between Federal Point and Smith Island. The new inlet was closed in the 1870s when the U.S. Corps of Engineers built the rocks between Federal Point and Zeke Island. When blockade runners entered the Cape Fear River, specifically through the old inlet, they would pass by the Price's Creek Range lighthouses. They consisted of multiple lights having one light station with smaller lighthouses in front of it. For the blockade runners, they served a similar purpose as guiding the ships up to Wilmington. An important place for blockade runners to stop and seek cover upon entering the Cape Fear River was Fort Anderson. Fort Anderson served as a Confederate defense along the Cape Fear River, and also served as a port to protect blockade runners. These were many of the geographical features along the lower Cape Fear which made it possible for blockade runners to get to Wilmington. Blockade running seems almost as brisk as ever. The new class of blockade runners are very fast and sometimes come in and play around our vessels. They are built entirely for speed. Rear Admiral Porter of the U.S. Navy. Blockade runner ships were light in design and were specifically built to outrun the blockade. Most of the vessels were produced in England and were designed for quick transport. The ships were long, narrow, and at a shallow draft, allowing it to cut through the water easily. It also had a powerful steam engine, allowing it to go faster. This quick and fast design made it possible for the blockade runners to slip past the blockade and enter the Cape Fear River and make it up to Wilmington. On average, blockade runners would usually travel of a speeds around 14 to 16 knots, which is much faster than the Union blockade ironclads, which usually traveled at around 6 knots. Blockade runner ships were also designed to go in shallow water, which allowed them to go through dangerous areas close to shore. Sandbars in very shallow water are prevalent in the Cape Fear River and Frying Pan Shoals, so blockade runners would often move through these areas away from the blockade. Blockade runners had to keep a low profile when approaching areas where Union ships were close by. The ships were lower to the water and painted gray to camouflage the ships in the water and along close to the shore. The lower design made it impossible to spot them along the horizon. Some ships even had collapsible smokestacks to decrease their profile even more. If you can build 2 very fast paddle wheels and pay for them, our means of placing cotton in your hands will be greatly increased. Their draft of water should be the least possible, as we may be compelled to use them in the shallow waters of Florida. Stephen Mallory, Confederate States Secretary of the Navy. Another way that blockade runners used to hide was using anthracite coal as fuel. Anthracite, also known as smokeless coal, is a highly carbonated coal which produces no smoke. This greatly lowered their profile along the horizon and made it difficult for them to spot. Throughout the Civil War, in the Cape Fear area, there were many blockade runners that have successfully ran the blockade or failed to do so. Blockade runner Cape is an important example of a blockade runner failure. Cape was responsible for causing a yellow fever outbreak in Wilmington. In August 1862, this blockade runner traveled from Nassau to Wilmington, carrying mosquitoes that carried the yellow fever. This resulted in an outbreak in Wilmington until November, and it killed between 450 and 700 people. On November 18, 1862, the blockade runner Kate partially sank in the mouth of Bonnet's Creek near Smithville. Her ribs were to be seen for many a day before the war ended, bleaching in the sun in one of the mudflats in the Cape Fear River. John Wilkinson, captain of a blockade runner. The CSS Robert E. Lee is a famous example of a blockade runner in the Cape Fear area. It was originally built in Scotland in 1860. In 1862, it was purchased by Alexander Colley and Company, then later purchased by the Confederate Navy. The CSS Robert E. Lee made its first successful run into Wilmington in January 1863, and proved it can outrun almost every ship. Over its career, CSS Robert E. Lee completed 33 successful voyages, making it the most successful blockade runner of the Civil War. CSS Robert E. Lee was captured by the Union on a voyage from Bermuda to Wilmington in November of 1863, and was renamed Fort Donelson. After the Civil War, it was sold to the Chilean Navy, as it stayed a military ship until 1868. Overall, blockade runners were very important to the Confederacy during the Civil War. They usually had success in the Cape Fear area when transporting the materials to Wilmington, since they used geographic features and ship design to their advantage. Blockade runners were definitely capable of breaking through Union Navy barriers.